We are, we should be live here, David.
Uh-huh.
Got it. Okay. And I'm going to also make sure that we record this just as a backup as well. Okay. Well, good morning, David. And good morning, everybody who may be watching live or later on. My name is Bhima Breckenridge. I'm the manager of East West here in Seattle. And I am really happy to be welcoming our guest, David Chernikoff, here. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much.
I want to say a few words before we get started, David, just to introduce you to people and introduce context for this conversation. David Chernikoff, we first heard about David, I think, through our former events coordinator, who was a student at Naropa University, where you taught. Are you still teaching there?
I'm not.
Okay.
No.
So former teacher at Naropa University. And, you know, David's spiritual life started with yoga practice in 1971. And in 1988, he started teaching insight meditation, and he's studied under many different teachers, even outside of the Buddhist / mindfulness tradition, including Ram Dass, Father Thomas Keating. I believe, did you study with Swami Satchidananda?
I did, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get a story about that. That'd be a lot of fun. And then also with Chogyam Trungpa.
Yes.
Amazing. And so that was the beginning of his spiritual life and as a teacher. And then since then, after Naropa, he's also worked with the Spiritual Eldering Institute, which has been renamed to Saging International, and is a guiding teacher at the Insight Meditation community in Boulder, Colorado. He also teaches workshops, just like we're going to be doing a class with you later on next month. And he's the author of the forthcoming book, Life Part 2 from Shambhala Publications. If you look in the description, I will be putting the link to purchase the book there, as well as the event that we're doing in January. We'll be going in depth into the book and into the second half of life, as Carl Jung puts it, as well as presenting 7 keys to awakening with purpose and joy as you age. And there will be time for Q&A during that event. And so, David, thank you so much for spending this time with us this morning.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
So if you could just start, maybe just as, as we're beginning this conversation, what was it that drew you inward from just the normal everyday life of going to college and getting a job and all of that? What was it that drew you to Eastern practices and teachings?
Well, there was one specific incident that really changed the course of my life significantly. When I was 13 years old, my father died suddenly and unexpectedly from a heart attack.
Wow.
And that particular event caused me to start asking a lot of the kinds of questions that many people don't ask until they're in their 50s.
Yeah.
But it turned our previously comfortable, insulated world upside down and inside out in a certain way. And my mother didn't really handle it very well emotionally and psychologically. It was quite traumatic for all of us. And so I started asking the kinds of questions that spiritual seekers have been asking for ages when I was a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
And although I didn't really have access to teachings at that point, the seed was planted with that event. When I then went to college, this was like the late 60s, so it was a particular zeitgeist, as
for sure.
all of us know. And I tried what a lot of my friends tried my first couple of years in college, which was to party my way to happiness. And sadly, but not so sadly, I failed miserably, because that's not really a viable path for me, at least. And it was at that point on my 21st birthday that I borrowed a book on yoga from a friend when I noticed it on his bookshelf. And essentially from there, I just never looked back.
Wow.
So I started to teach myself yoga postures and meditation. I realized at a certain point, about 9 months later, I needed a teacher and more of a guide than the book,
Right.
which was when I discovered Swami Satchidananda, who had a book out then called Integral Yoga Hatha, and eventually became a student of his and trained in his institute to teach his method, which was called Integral Yoga. And the path began to unfold from there pretty organically, actually. Like I allowed the path to carry me forward from there rather than having to push it or force it.
Mm-hmm. And did your experience of hatha yoga, of doing the postures, did that just naturally lead to an interest in meditation, or did you have meditative experiences from that practice?
It was quite natural, actually, because in particular, yoga nidra, the deep relaxation state,
Mm-hmm.
shavasana, it's also called, at the end of most periods of practice, introduced me to what meditation really was.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to see the relationship between body and mind, among other things, that they really weren't as separate as they were often presented to be in the culture.
Mm-hmm.
That when I took a slow, deep breath, my emotional state relaxed as well, not just my body. Yeah. And so, among other things, Swami Satchidananda taught mantra meditation, which was a wonderful way to learn how to make the mind more stable and
Mm-hmm.
concentrated and focused. And for me, um, it was just a godsend, frankly, to discover the skills and tools that he was teaching and to realize that I wasn't nearly as powerless in relation to difficult emotions as I had previously believed myself to be.
Right, right. I mean, that's something in the West. It's not even talked about. I mean, even for myself, I was a kid in the '90s and the early 2000s, and you'd think after the '60s, 50 years later, that would be something. It's only now, 20 years later, that we're seeing in some progressive areas mindfulness and yoga classes for kids in schools. So
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
yeah.
Yeah. It took a long time to get to the children.
Mm-hmm.
Um, But I remember when I was an undergraduate student, my senior year, they wanted me to do an honors thesis. I made a proposal that I teach an 8-week hatha yoga class at the local mental health center
Wow.
and then measure the personality changes
Mm-hmm.
that would be clear to me because I'd seen them in myself.
Right.
Um, Sadly, because psychology in the late 60s and early 70s was very behavioral in its orientation at the school I went to, I was told that that was a nice idea, but it wasn't psychology.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I was told to go talk to the philosophy department.
Oh gosh,
Right.
we've come some way. So
Well, yeah. Look at mindfulness-based stress reduction now,
yeah,
right?
yeah, for sure.
That's exactly what I saw happen in my own life
Mm-hmm.
and what I was proposing, but I was in New Orleans at Tulane University, and it was a little bit too on the fringe, I think, for the department.
Right. Well, apart from getting that book off of your friend's that yoga book off of your friend's bookshelf, and then spending time with Satchidananda, how did you get more into the formal meditation practice you're doing today? Insight meditation, vipassana, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what happened was in 1974, summer of 74, Trungpa Rinpoche created the first summer event that was then called Naropa Institute, eventually evolved into Naropa University, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he invited many of the highly respected spiritual teachers in the country at the time to come to Boulder for that summer.
Mm.
One of them was Ram Dass, who was coming to teach the Bhagavad Gita. And his book, his classic book, Be Here Now, had come out in 71 and was somewhat of a Bible for me in my own yoga and meditation practice.
Me too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's such a classic,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so I came out to study with Ram Dass that summer.
Was he the draw then? Were you already connected
He,
with Rinpoche?
I
Or
hadn't met Trungpa, no. What happened that summer, the short form of what happened that summer, which could be a good novel, basically, was that Ram Dass taught on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. and Trungpa Rinpoche taught on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, right? Ram Dass's class had like 800 people in it,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
And so we jokingly called it the Buddhist versus the Hindus, right? And some people were taking both classes and getting totally confused.
Right, right.
And I decided to just focus on studying with Ram Dass and deepening my yoga practice. But by the end of that summer, I had heard enough about Buddhism and Trungpa Rinpoche and some of the other Buddhist teachers who were a part of that summer institute that my interest was piqued.
Mm-hmm.
And I began to explore Buddhism a little bit, primarily through a book that Rinpoche wrote called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which was somewhat of a classic for Western Buddhist practitioners because it had a unique perspective on how Westerners were dealing with spiritual teachings, both skillfully and sometimes unskillfully.
Right, creating a
But
super ego in
yeah,
some
like
cases.
a spiritual superego,
Yeah,
basically,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And also, Trungpa Rinpoche was a complex figure, no question about it, and he had a unique perspective on Western spiritual practice and training because he'd been trained classically in Tibet. He'd studied at Oxford. He
Mm-hmm.
studied Western culture, Western art, Western psychology, and he really saw both the purity of heart of the Westerners who were coming to Buddhism
Mm-hmm.
and the ego and the deluded states that they were bringing with them.
Yeah.
Right. And he had a way of challenging the deluded dimensions and inspiring the deeper dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And although life became complex in that community and he became a complex teaching figure, I'll always have gratitude for the fact that I was introduced to Buddhist meditation by him and
Yeah.
his senior teachers.
Yeah.
And a couple of years after that, I left that community, and Joseph Goldstein wrote his first book on insight meditation,
Mm-hmm.
which was 1976. And that book led me into studying with Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, and
Mm-hmm.
other people associated with that insight meditation tradition.
Okay, cool. Well, one of the things, I mean, it's a little off topic, but you seem like a good person to ask. I've been interested in the fact that so many of these, like Ram Dass and his kind of collective of teachers that came that went to see Neem Karoli Baba and came back to the West, have had quite a lot of overlap or connection with Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed that as well?
I have.
Yeah. Can you speak to that at all? Because it seems like it's more interspiritual than there's more crossover between. I mean, I see even still Krishna Das does retreats with Sharon Salzberg, and the Be Here Now network has purely Buddhist podcasts on it. There just seems to be such a collaboration between yoga and Buddhism there that I don't see with other groups.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of the people who initially went to the East in the 60s and 70s were, in a sense, generic spiritual seekers,
Mm-hmm.
right? They rejected the materialism of Western life in certain respects. They wanted something deeper and more meaningful. And there was a certain kind of openness, because there was a sense of yearning and searching, but nobody exactly knew what for.
Right.
Right. It was hard to articulate what that yearning was associated with. And depending upon where they went, if they went to Dharamsala, they had one kind of experience. If they went to Kathmandu, they had a different kind of experience. If they went to Bodh Gaya or to Thailand, right, they would have a different experience, sometimes more Hindu or more Buddhist.
Right.
But many of these folks had rejected the Abrahamic traditions they'd grown up with and were exposed to and excited about these Eastern traditions, in part because they were more experiential.
Right.
Right? It wasn't about the sermon or about the word or about the Eucharist, or it wasn't about the ritual per se. It was the experience of meditation or deep prayer or deep contemplation which had a powerfully transformative effect on people
Mhm.
and enabled people to see what these spiritual words we were all using were talking about, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And so it's one thing to talk about unitive consciousness and, over a kind of a vegetarian dinner at your friend's house, right? And it's another thing to go into a deep meditative state and experience the boundaries of your individuality dissolving, and to experience that there's a level upon which we are not as separate as we feel most of the time,
Mhm.
right? And it was that dimension that I think really appealed to people and drew a lot of these folks to those Eastern teachings. And then, depending upon almost um, serendipity in certain ways, like they ended up at Neem Karoli Baba's ashram, or they ended up at as a Buddhist monk on a beach in Thailand somewhere, or
Yeah.
you know, I mean, it seemed that people were drawn by circumstance oftentimes because there was a kind of a pilgrimage circuit, you could
Mhm.
say.
I see.
And they'd meet somebody and their friend would say, you have to come meet this teacher. She's just amazing. And it didn't matter if the teacher was Hindu or Buddhist because
Right.
there was just this hunger and this yearning.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, that
And
that helps explain it quite a bit. I mean, I guess in a sense, there's just a recognition that these individuals who have now started their own spiritual works and things, they were all just seekers together, and they just landed in different traditions. Then is that kind of what you're saying?
I think so. And I
Yeah.
think there was a certain intuitive understanding that started to come for those who stayed with it in a committed way, that the fundamental process of spiritual awakening involved actualizing our best human qualities, qualities like compassion and wisdom and loving kindness and generosity and patience and humor, for example,
Mm-hmm.
right? And for those who stayed with the practice and deepened it in a committed way, there was this recognition that that's what it was all about in some sense. And the methods were just methods. They weren't ends in themselves,
Right.
right?
Right.
The vision was to become an awakened human being who manifested those qualities and brought them to fruition and
Mm-hmm.
used life to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And whether the methods were Buddhist or Hindu or Quaker or Jewish or
Yeah.
Wiccan for that matter, right?
Yeah.
You know, that began to become increasingly secondary for a
Right.
lot of people, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely, to me, it's a good energy to keep going. And
Mhm.
in just doing a little reading on your website, you've continued to work with other spiritual traditions in that same, with that same understanding. Um,
Mhm.
so in you got the book from Goldstein, or Goldstein's book, and you started working with insight meditation. Um,
Mhm.
where did your interest in conscious aging develop? How did that get started?
Well, that was also very specific, actually. So at one point in the 80s, I went to Asia to study with Tibetan Buddhist teachers in Kathmandu and to work for an organization Ram Dass had co-created with some colleagues and friends called the Seva Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did public health consulting and educational work for the Seva Foundation. And I studied with a particular Tibetan teacher named Trongku Rinpoche, who was one of a number of people in the Tibetan Buddhist section of Kathmandu. And I had the good fortune to be there for 3 years and
Wow.
really commit to that practice and look deeply at the Tibetan perspective on Buddhist teachings. Um, and then when I came back in 1990, um, I wasn't really sure what to do. I mean, I'd met the woman who has been my wife for the last 30 plus years over in Kathmandu, actually, where she was working as a physical therapist for UNICEF and various children's programs. And so we came back, and I had been in Boulder before I went to Asia for a number of years. And so um, it seemed to me like Naropa University, having been founded by a Tibetan Buddhist and being a Buddhist university, would be somewhat like a halfway house for me,
Right.
returning like a Nepalophile coming back to the United States.
Right.
It would be the perfect job, basically.
Yeah.
So I made some contacts and was hired full-time to teach at Naropa University, which I started to do in the fall of 1990. And it was there that the issue of aging came up about 6 years later, 1996. There was a grant given by a foundation to Naropa University to create a chair in the Religious Studies Department called the World Wisdom Chair. And they invited a Jewish teacher named Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who most students and friends call Reb Zalman. They invited him to take that chair and teach at Naropa University. And he had previously founded this organization called the Spiritual Eldering Institute, which was a program of conscious aging and training facilitators and leaders and offering programs around the country and different parts of the world to help, in his words, shift the paradigm that we had for aging in our culture, which he saw to be quite negative and pernicious and unhelpful.
Right.
His goal being in part to bring back the role of the wise elder into modern Western society. So I met Reb Zalman. He and I just clicked from the get-go. We had a very auspicious initial meeting, after which he invited me to join their board of directors, which I was very enthusiastic about. And then the more I learned about what they were teaching, I decided to train and become certified as a facilitator for the organization. And about 18 months later, they hired me to be their education and training director. So it was a real deep dive at that point. And I was 46 when I met him. I'm 71 now. What's changed is that aging was quite theoretical at 46. It's not nearly as theoretical at this point.
For sure, for sure.
And I thank God on a regular basis that I was able to start deprogramming all the negative messaging that I got from our culture 25 years ago, rather than having to do that when I hit 70 or something of that sort.
That's an interesting point. So what? Because I'm afraid to say I'm 27. What I mean, what deprogramming? I mean, this is helpful for people who are not in perhaps the second half of life yet, and making it applicable to them. What is some of that deprogramming that you had to do at 46?
Well, first of all, the basic message that we get about aging is that it's very bad news, right?
Yeah.
We are somewhat obsessed as a culture with youth, and we put youth on a high pedestal. And I mean, I think youth is wonderful, right? I also think the rest of life is wonderful. And depending upon your particular experience, the messaging is something like life is downhill from fill in the blank, 49, 59, 39 in the case of Jack Benny, right? But that your quality of life is going to go downhill. Reb Zalman used to say that what our culture does with older people is wants to throw them away like an old shoe, right? And we start to disregard the contributions of older people at a certain point. And if you look at the stereotypes in the media, the fuddy-duddy elders in comedies, like the grandparent figures who are kind of useless and maybe demented in some way, or suffering from Alzheimer's, or not able to function well, right? And that's completely contrary to the basic message in most indigenous cultures, where there's an intuitive recognition of the link between long life experience and wisdom.
Duh.
Right? I mean,
yeah.
Right. I mean, capital D, right?
Yeah.
Because the assumption there's no assumption here that you automatically become wise if you're old. we've all met elders who personify how we don't want to age.
Right.
Right? But what we're saying in the conscious aging movement is that if you have the tools and the commitment, you can learn from long life experience and essentially transform who you are into an increasingly wise and loving human being who, in the Native American tradition, is capable of looking 7 lifetimes and years into the future, right? And understanding what future generations need to be doing, right? You can see from a very broad and wide perspective, right? Which is part of what wisdom's about, seeing the big picture and how the present moment relates to that context. So for me, for example, my body certainly has changed from when I was a 23-year-old yoga teacher, right? I mean, I weigh about the same, frankly, but in terms of flexibility and some knee problems that I had and some things that have happened in the course of living my life and so forth, I'm certainly not physically able to do things I was able to do in my 20s and 30s, right? At the same time, my appreciation for life and my sense of how rich and mysterious and amazing it is increases day by day. And in the course of my years of working with older people in the Spiritual Eldering Institute and now in Saging International and in my meditation retreats and workshops on the topic and so forth, I've met so many amazing elders who are celebratory about the stage of life that they're in, right? And the research that we have shows very clearly that oftentimes people in their 60s and 70s are in the happiest stage of life, actually.
Right.
But somehow you don't get that message from the culture, right? The message you get is quite the opposite. And it's very sad because it leads a certain number of people to actually feel some embarrassment and humiliation and almost shame about being an older person with certain physical needs or less sharp of a memory than they had when they were in college or something of that sort, right? And that's part of what inspired me to want to do this work. It feels to me like there's a tremendous amount of highly unnecessary suffering in relation to the aging process that goes on in our culture in particular, right? And it reminds me of when I did hospice work in the late 70s and 80s. I was inspired by Ram Dass and Stephen Levine and a number of other people, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross.
Dale Borglum.
Yeah, I worked with Dale.
Yeah, we just hosted him last month.
Yeah. I worked at the dying center that Dale had in Santa Fe.
Oh, cool.
And he needed to go raise money to do workshops, so he invited me down there to run it while he was away.
Oh, neat.
You know,
Small world.
Yeah, that was in 1982.
Okay.
Fall of 82, you know, and then he went out and did workshops, made some money, came back, and I got hired to direct a hospice in Las Cruces, New Mexico, down south of Santa Fe, right? But the thing about the hospice movement was that even though our hospitals were quite good at keeping people alive, we all know that the end of a life is a very spiritually significant time. And that's not recognized in an ICU when you're hooked up to tubes and things. It's not the kind of sacred environment or attitude that most of us would want to experience when we're about to exit into whatever comes next. Right. And so the hospice movement was partly saying there's a more compassionate and wise and skillful way to deal with these end-of-life situations than what our culture is doing. Right? That's the same feeling I have about the aging process. There's a wiser and more compassionate and loving way to teach ourselves how to appreciate all of the stages of life and see them for what they are and appreciate and celebrate each stage as it is, rather than set up a hierarchy where, you know, life is great up to 30 and then basically it's a downhill run from there.
Right.
I just don't believe that, and it doesn't fit my experience. Yeah.
Well, you speaking about this, it does, and speaking about how the culture was not supportive to that aging process, it does seem like, if for those in the second half of life to achieve, or not achieve necessarily, but to be able to have space to open up into that elderhood, like you were saying in the indigenous cultures, to be revered and to have that insight that can come. It would seem to me that it's all of our part. It takes all of our effort, and all of us holding that space for individuals who reach the second half of life to be able, to be supported in that. Otherwise, if there's a sense that I'm less than because I don't have the mental acuity or the physical strength or whatever, you can see it'd be very hard for somebody to blossom into those gifts that come later on.
Well, also, it's not just the elders who lose out, because
right.
part of what gives meaning to being an elder is mentoring younger people.
Exactly.
Right? But because we've stratified our society horizontally and dropped the vertical, everybody loses. The younger people don't get the benefit of mentoring, good mentors, and the mentors don't get the meaning and purpose of sharing what they've learned in their long life experience.
Yeah.
So it's a lose-lose arrangement in a certain sense.
No Obi-Wan Kenobi, no Merlin.
No Yoda for that.
Yeah, no Gandalf.
Right.
It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. Wow.
Well, and when I look at my spiritual life, it's been all about mentoring.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
Father Thomas Keating just died not that long ago at 95.
Yeah.
Right. I met him in 1981. Right. So we had 37 years of connection, over which we stayed in touch, and I looked at him as an interspiritual mentor of a certain kind, who was just an incredible blessing in my life. Right? Ram Dass was like the penultimate mentor.
Yeah.
For a whole generation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he kind of was like the flagship for the generation that I was coming of age in. And so, yeah, I think mentoring is one of the things that we teach in our work at Saging International, and that we use at the Spiritual Eldering Institute, right? There's a skill set associated with mentoring.
Yeah.
And I'd love to see more sort of intergenerational connection. For sure. For just that reason.
Well, it kind of reminds me a few years back when I started managing the bookstore, at 23 or 24 or something. And I was talking to Rick. This is kind of an expose a little bit, but I don't mind because it's instructive. I was talking to Rick and I was saying, it's very difficult for me to offer guidance in the right way with the staff, especially since almost everybody's older than me, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years older than me. And he said, that'll come with age. And it lifted a burden off of me, because I didn't know in my 25-year-old body how to hold space for people, and he said, that's not what that period of time of life is really so much about. You're in more of the getting done and moving energy phase. And, you will naturally blossom into a place where the fires cool down a little bit. And then your gift will be to be more of a mentor, to be more of a listener and sharing. And I'm still, obviously trying to weave those in. But it gave me some pause, because I thought that was the first time I really had grokked the idea of that is the gift of elderhood, is that is more of your native center that you're living in, and the fruits of this spiritual life. So a little bit of a funny one, seeing me, just barely in my britches here, trying to. But anyway, that's just what occurred to me there. And David, if we could just focus in the last part of our conversation here about the event that we're doing in January. We're basing it off of the new book, Life Part 2. And the 7 keys, and maybe without getting into the content, because we want to save some for our gathering next month. But what is it particularly about this book that you were hoping to share about this subject?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What was the impetus for it?
Well, what inspired it, a couple of things inspired it. One is that I've been an avid reader since I was about 4 years old. And it's been a very rich and important part of my life. And there's always been a part of me that had a certain desire to offer to other people the kind of gifts that these writers were offering to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember years ago, even as a child, thinking how amazing it would be to be able to offer that to other people, right? Then if you fast forward, I did get into teaching and sharing what I'd learned from a lot of books. And I wrote short articles for newsletters and academic purposes and things of that sort, but I'd never really tried to write a book.
Yeah.
And a few years back, I saw 70 coming up. And I've done enough Buddhist training to know that at some point I'm not going to be here. And I thought to myself, I think writing a book had become a bucket list item for me. And I thought to myself, I've been so blessed. Like this year, it's 50 years since I was introduced to meditation training and spiritual teachings. And what a blessing that's been. So if I could express my appreciation to the teachers who taught me and for the circumstances of life that allowed me to have access to these teachings by passing along some of what I've learned, that would feel really wonderful to me and hopefully be of benefit to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And that led me to want to try to capture a kind of map, if you will, of when I look back, what was the map I was using to move into what hopefully is a certain kind of wise elderhood or some semblance of that.
Right.
And that was really the impetus behind the book. What could I share from what I've learned that would help my life come to completion in a certain sense, and also be of benefit to other people who hopefully could relate to what it is I was presenting.
Wow. Well, it's interesting you used the word map, because isn't that what Ram Dass said when he was going to India? I was looking for a map of consciousness. Yeah. Well, well, that's very exciting. So this map is comprised of these 7 keys that you talk about in the book, and we'll be discussing. Is that right?
It is.
Good.
It is. Yep.
Well, David, I think that's it for now for this short conversation. I really do appreciate you taking the time, and really looking forward to diving into these keys next month and celebrating the release of the book. It comes out. It says it's coming out December 21st is the publication date. So right on the solstice, a very auspicious time. And like I said, I'll be putting in the link to purchase the book. You can purchase the book through our bookshop.org affiliate link. I'll be putting that into the comment on the video. And in the description, you should see the link to join us on Zoom next month with David. David, thank you so much for spending this time. It's been great to meet you, and looking forward to to the event we do next month.
Thanks for inviting me, Bhima. I'm glad we could do this too.
Awesome. Well, take care, and we'll see you later.
Okay. Bye now.